Dr. Marcus Ross is a paleontologist, a Christian, a longtime participant in the discussion of creation, evolution, and our understanding of Scripture and science. Dr. Ross has a Bachelor of Science in Earth Science from Penn State University, an MS in Vertebrate Paleontology from South Dakota School of Mines, a PhD in Geoscience from the University of Rhode Island. He taught at Liberty University from 2005 to 2021 and served as a professor of geology and the director of Center for Creation Studies. He now works as the founder. He is the founder and CEO of Cornerstone Educational Supply, which is a science supply company, and he can tell you more about that. He lives in Lynchburg, Virginia, with his wife and 4 children. So, Dr. Ross, before we begin, I'd like to pray. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for Dr. Ross and his knowledge, the field of creation, and we look forward to hearing from him and broadening our understanding of your creation, Father. And we pray a blessing on this discussion this evening and on him and his family. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Dr. Ross.
Thank you so much. And thank you all here at Covenant Presbyterian Church for your generosity and for your hospitality. It has been a wonderful couple of days for me. I came in here initially for a different conference, speaking at a small conference on creation and the issue of Adam and Adam's historicity. What is it like to be in the image of God? And Phyllis nabbed me and said, "You could do more things." And you chuckle because it sounds probably familiar to you. And Phyllis says we could do more things. And so it's been a real wonderful privilege. As I said in the Sunday school class yesterday, I don't take the opportunity to speak before a church body or to teach from the Word of God lightly. It's a very important sort of responsibility. And we're told that we are judged all the more severely for doing so. And so I pray that the Lord would keep me in the straight and narrow and in the steady on this as we jump into a little more of the science. I talked a little bit about this yesterday as Jack and I had a chance to do a kind of fireside chat, and we did that again today at Covenant, and it was just a wonderful time. And yesterday I talked a little bit about some of those hominin fossils and those different people groups that are out there, things like the Neanderthals and this short group of people called Homo floresiensis that were only 3.5 feet tall. They weighed 40, 50 pounds, and yet they were full adult people and doing all sorts of interesting things. But tonight I get back a little bit more towards my first love of paleontology more specifically and the types of fossils that got me interested in all of this stuff. I caught the dinosaur bug when I was 4. It was way early on. I remember distinctly, just closing my eyes right now, I can put myself back in my cousin's room where he had a little record player, and you all actually know what that means. Tell my students, and they're like, "Oh yeah, those cool retro things." No, it wasn't retro. It was original. Those little 45, the little 45 records that were the read-alongs. And he was putting one of those on, and he didn't have the book, but it was about dinosaurs. And so I was hearing this record play and hearing the roaring and the crashing and the screeching and dun 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 dun, and turn the page. And I was hooked. I was completely hooked. And I told my parents I like dinosaurs, and they got me the little plastic Bago dinosaurs, which had all manner of different things, some of which were dinosaurs, some of which weren't, but everything was fuchsia and yellow and orange because it was 1980. And the T-Rex never, if you ever had that packet, the T-Rex always fell over. It just had these weird little 3 toes that poked that it just didn't work, and the Trachodon was in the karate pose. It was, you had your kung fu dinosaurs. That's amen. When I was 7 years old, I learned that there was such a thing as a paleontologist, and at that point, I wanted to be a paleontologist, and from that point onward, yes, I wanted to be an astronaut. Yes, I wanted to fly an F-14 fighter pilot because I I watched Top Gun. You know, you had to do those things as a kid. I wanted to be a baseball player, but all of that really kind of took second fiddle as if paleontology doesn't work out. Or maybe I could do that, but I could also be a paleontologist. That was never gone from my mind. And so paleontology brings you into an immediate conflict over issues of Christianity and science. It brings you into the question of what is the Bible saying about Earth history versus what were my dinosaur books saying about Earth history. And I recall being as young as 9 and sitting down in our playroom. It was just a little, like, 6 by 10 room. It was like a spare room that we turned into a place with the Legos and the games. And I had to start trying to think, well, the Bible is telling me this about the days of creation and about Adam and Noah. My dinosaur books are saying dinosaurs lived many millions of years ago. What do I do about that? And little did I understand at that time that in my kiddie mind I was running through ideas that we would now call things like gap theory or day age or theistic evolution. I didn't have evolution in my mind. That wasn't, it wasn't as big of an issue in the late 70s, early 80s. It wasn't taught in schools so much, so I wasn't aware of that. But I was wondering, did God create dinosaurs before he created Adam and Eve? And that would be very much like a gap theory view. And I was wondering, well, are the days really what I think they are? Or could the days be something else? Could they be like big, long ages? And the dinosaurs were on some other age. And that would be day age theory or progressive creation as it's called today. And what that tells me is, one, I was a weird little kid. But as I'm now a dad, and I have weird little kids of my own, what I realize is kids ask hard questions early on. They ask very hard questions early on, and they might not have the vocabulary, and they might not have all the theological background or the scientific background, but they want to know the same sorts of answers that we end up asking later on when we finally encounter a conflict or two things that don't seem to mesh. So I ended up going into paleontology. My dad was wise enough to say, get a degree in geology, just in case paleontology, that seems really narrow. Let's get you a geology degree, and if you still like it, you can keep on going on your own dime later on. For the first one, you get anything after that is on you. And it's still on me. But we're almost done with paying off those last little bits of the loans. So I went to Penn State University. And it was at that time that I really was confronted with the issues of creation and evolution. I had dabbled in them a little bit during high school because every once in a while there was an interesting court case or something in the news and I'd pay attention. But you guys remember the 80s. Information was a little harder to get. You had your library, you had Time magazine, you had the evening news, you had those things. But you couldn't just call up anything on the internet. There was no internet. So by the time I get to college, and I'm in my first year of geology classes, of taking physical geology and historical geology, I realize I'm a young earth creationist because that's what I believe the Bible tells me, but I have no real understanding of what the science is behind this stuff. Is there any science behind it? And so I would order from Christian book distributors a big old Henry Morris pack, and it had 8 books for the right low price of whatever I could afford at the moment. And I only got the Henry Morris pack because that's all I could afford. I couldn't get the Dwayne Gish one. That would have to come later on. And I started reading and reading voraciously as much as I could. And I figured, well, they started with the Genesis flood. I'll start reading with that one that was published in 1961. And by that time, science has changed a lot since the 1960s. But nonetheless, it was a good place to start, get anchored, start thinking about things. And as a geology student, I would start to realize that, well, some of the things that I read in the creation books were helpful and worthwhile. Some of them didn't quite match now with where we are. And that process of trying to work through and become a critical thinker. You guys have this lovely Christian school here. This is an awesome facility. And I know that one of the things that you hope to do with your kids is to teach them critical thinking, to be able to evaluate information and then turn it around and say, and this is how I can make sense of it. Do that by giving them hard problems. Because what I had to do every night when I came back from my dorm room was to sit and think through the question of what did I learn today? What was brute fact? What were the real just discoveries from the natural world? There is a thing called Tyrannosaurus rex. That's a real thing. The dinosaurs are real. We found them in these deposits in these places. That's legitimate. So what did I learn today that was absolute brute fact? What did I learn today that was a reasonable inference from that fact? T-Rex's diet, behaviors, how much did it weigh, what was its predatory behavior? Those are inferences that are sometimes wild and sometimes not so wild. What was that? And what did I learn today that was really speculative? What did I learn today that comports with what I understand about the Bible's perspective on who we are as people made in the image of God? What did I learn today that challenged that? And that is what drives critical thinking. Critical thinking doesn't happen on a multiple choice test. As a college professor, I can tell you that's not where it happens, despite what our administrators sometimes think. There's no critical thinking test. That's a semester. It's a semester of hard thought. Give them that. They need it. As our culture becomes, at times and in places, more difficult for them, they're going to need it. It's never been safe to be a Christian. We happen to be in a time when it's pretty safe. But in the history of Christendom, we live in a time where the onus is on us to be bold because we can. We can be more bold than anybody else because we suffer the least consequences. And even if this culture turns sour on us, we still have an immense privilege and therefore a much higher opportunity. I'm a big fan of Spider-Man. He was always my favorite. With great power comes great responsibility. And I remember that from before it was a movie. So today, as we take or this evening, as we take a look at this, the earth, I believe, is quite young. I think that is the testimony of both Scripture and also there is a testimony from the natural world, from the sciences about this. I think there's a lot of good reasons scripturally to hold to a young earth perspective. I'm not going to go through all of these by any means, but these are some of the things that I think are big topics that point us towards a recognition of a young earth. The structure of Genesis 1, the nature of the fall as a cosmic event that affects the entirety of the natural world. The statements of Exodus 20 and Exodus 31 where God reflects back on through the Ten Commandments on creation. We can say, for in 6 days the Lord God made the heavens, the earth, the seas, and all that's in them. That seemed to knock down my 9-year-old thought that maybe God made things before the 6 days of creation, because he's saying absolutely everything. And later on, as I would come to understand through people smarter than me, things about Hebrew and the structure of the language in here, and how the Hebrews thought, yeah, this isn't only what I thought on the surface. As we plumb the depths, it makes a lot more sense. I'm going to focus here on just one right now, and that is actually Noah's flood, as something that is global in scope for humans and animals. That is a universal event, not just universal for humanity because we were in a small place, but universal in terms of the entire world, both known and unknown to the people at that time. So God's stated intention at the beginning of the flood that we see in Genesis chapter 6, verse 7. God says that he will blot out man whom I've created from the face of the land. But not only man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens. I will make an end of all flesh. The Hebrew word here for flesh is basar, and that can refer to flesh like animal flesh when they make an offering and you take the flesh out. But it's also a euphemism for all things mortal. There's a place where you've seen these words, like the creeping things and the birds of the heaven. You've seen those in the few pages just before. Genesis 1, the terminology is very much the same. Creeping things, beasts of the earth, the birds of the air, that sort of thing. And as we take a look at the terminology that's used in Genesis chapter 6 and 7 and 8 to talk about what's being destroyed, it's very reminiscent of Genesis 1, and it's done that way on purpose. As I've told other classes in the past, and as I mentioned in the Sunday school, you cannot understand the flood narrative for what it really is unless you have an understanding of the Genesis creation account first. And then you get to see how it's playing off of that to show us that we are in an entirely new creation, a renovated world, if you will, that has been cleansed of evil. And it certainly was evil. God says in a literally damning critique of humanity that all the thoughts of man were only evil all the time. One of the things that we see as evidence that the perspective here is universal is the density of universal language in this narrative. The Hebrew word that we translate as all or every or everything, it's just one Hebrew word. It's kol. And it's used with immense frequency in the Genesis flood account. Over 60 different times, and it's used in conjunction with the animal groups throughout the flood narrative. In my PowerPoints, I try to make things legible until you need to get a point that something is so big that I can only just give it to you all at once. That's one of these situations here. This is the Genesis account from Genesis chapter 6 up in the corner all the way to the end of chapter 9. Not the end, but the end of the flood portion before we then get to Noah and his sons and the situation that happens there. So we've got 3.5 chapters basically here, and listed in the red here are all of the universal terms that we see. Almost all of those are kol, all, every, and everything, and we translate them differently because otherwise in English it gets awful boring, and we lose some nuance to that. And you can see particularly that we've got a heavy density here and there, right? Up through here, and then there's this big vacant spot. So what's happening here first is God saying, I'm going to destroy absolutely everything, and he keeps being repetitious about this. And to our modern ears, this sounds sometimes a little dull. Like, didn't God just say that? But you have to remember that God is trying to teach us in the way that your mom tried to teach you when you were a little kid. You've got to say it over and over and over again in order for it to sink in. I had to take out the trash every day. That was my job as a kid, to take out the trash. My mother was fastidious in our home. That is the kindest word that I can bring to it, because part of me wants to say words that are a little rougher on that, but my mom's wonderful. But she is fastidious, and she was immaculate in the home. Trash had to go out every day. The recycling had to go out every day. She rinsed the recycling cans, but they still had to leave because somehow overnight they would become wicked. I don't know. Everything was unclean. And I was not always the brightest light, and I was occasionally a lazy and procrastinative type, and still am. And so she would have to remind me that every day the trash gets taken out. Which days are those, Mom? Every day that ends in day, Marcus. Yeah, that's coal days, every day, all day, every day. This vacant zone over here is when the waters actually start to go down. So we get God's saying, I'm going to destroy absolutely everything. What sorts of things? Bring every sort into the ark, every creeping thing into the ground. And then we hit this heavy density where the waters are rising, they're covering all of the land, everyone is dying, all the animals are dying, everything of this kind, and all the mountains are now covered and everything, and it's all dying, and it's overwhelming. And that's the point. It is literally overwhelming the world. But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the lives, I missed one of them, that were with him in the ark. And from this point on, when we start to follow the pattern of Genesis chapter 1 as the flood waters go down, and eventually starts off with God having a wind that he passes over the earth. That's the Hebrew word ruach, which is the same as spirit. So just like in Genesis 1, a water-covered world, God has his spirit over the waters. Now we have a water-covered world where God sends his ruach once again. The waters start to go down, and then the mountains poke up like they do on day 3, and then Noah sends out birds like it's day 5, and then eventually he leaves the ark with all of the animals and the people like it's day 6. And then there is a worship of God because it's a lot like the Sabbath. And when we see that in the text, we can see the density of the language, and then we can see this pattern of recreation. God is starting all over again. So what we see then is that Noah's flood is global from that, but also then when we see Noah come off of the ark, we have this lovely oration by God, 2 of them, in which God talks about how the promise that he is going to make, that when you see the bow in the clouds, that God will see it, and he will remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature and all flesh that is on the earth. So this isn't just for people. The bow is in the sky so that God will remember his promise to man and all flesh, all basar, all the flesh. And this word bow is interesting because it's a double entendre here. It's not only the rainbow, but the rainbow is also shaped very much like a standard warrior's bow. And by God hanging it up in the sky, he is not pointing the arrows down anymore. He is not at war with mankind, but he has laid his bow in the sky. The string would point the arrow up in a position of peace. And I never learned that growing up. That was my sister throwing theology books out, and I go, this is really neat. She's like, you didn't know? Yeah, this is really neat. So God promises this to all of the living creatures. It's not just us. And as a result, I think that the flood narrative lends itself very well to a universal perspective, a worldwide, and what we would now call global perspective. Sometimes I get somebody in the Old Testament who chides me and they're like, Marcus, they didn't think in terms of a globe back then. I'm like, I know that. Come on, work with me, people, right? Fine. Worldwide, we can use that term, however big it was. And I find that the text is rather difficult to reconcile with Old Earth views, because those Old Earth views tend to posit Noah's flood as either a local flood that is perhaps universal to humans, or it is a questionably historical event that was not universal for either humans or animals, but has been written up theologically in order to make a universalized point. This is a very common perspective. You would find this with someone like John Walton, who is an Old Testament professor at Wheaton, now retired, but his views are becoming very popular. If you enjoy the Bible Project videos, which I do, sadly, Walton's Genesis theology is an anchor point for a lot of what they do in there, and that worries me a little bit. But ever since the 1800s, when the argument for an ancient Earth started making serious headway within Christian seminaries and higher education at the time, the flood became basically a point that was thought to be only localized. And before the discovery of large numbers of people outside of the Middle East and some of the fossil groups and whatnot, people thought, well, maybe everybody just lived around Mesopotamia, around the Tigris and the Euphrates. But now we know that's not the case. People are kind of all over the place, but they still don't think that there was evidence of a global flood. So that means that the flood has got to be something that is more or less kind of mythological, or has been built up from an event that killed, sure, a lot of people. And that's why the ancient Mesopotamians and the Babylonians have flood narratives, because we all have this kind of resident memory of an event, but everybody mythologized it in their own way. But God's going to redeem it in some way. And I find that unconvincing. I find that to be something that is difficult to reconcile with what seems to be a very historical account in the flood here. I apologize, I didn't bring these with me. I have these particular cards, and I can send them actually. Phyllis, I'll mail a bunch to you, so if anybody would like to have these, we can make them available to the church. This is that geologic timescale that I was mentioning yesterday, and we've got our different zones. We've got, basically, when we think of the fossil record, we're mostly thinking from this blue on up through the yellow. Most of the rocks down here in the red and the orange and the purple have very little of interesting fossils. It's mostly bacteria and algae and some things like that. So when we think about going out and finding fossils, we're always in this set of units up over here, which, interestingly, traditionally were called the primary, the secondary, and the tertiary, referring to rocks that were formed during the flood, as well as possibly some that were formed after the flood, and I still think that's probably correct. We've got rocks that were formed during Noah's flood, some rocks that were formed after Noah's flood. Within Young Earth Creationism, we have a lot of bickering right now about this particular boundary, but it's my presentation, so I'm right. The other folks that I'm friends with, they prefer the flood boundary to be much higher up. They want to include a lot more of these mammal fossil groups up over here as part of the flood. I'm not convinced. I think that this is probably part of that recolonization. But nonetheless, we still all agree that there are creation week rocks, there are flood rocks, and there are post-flood rocks. And in yesterday's discussion, I mentioned that we all are in agreement that the hominin record seems to be a post-flood one. So we're just kind of bickering amongst ourselves about what do you do with some of those big mammals in the fossil record that look like stuff out of Tolkien. What you do is you dig them up and have fun. Anyway. So the premise of Young Earth Creation is that Noah's flood is going to be able to provide us with a framework to understand these paleontological data, hopefully with a robust reading of the biblical text as our guide. So I think that, like there are many good reasons to be a Young Earth Creationist from a theological standpoint, there are also some very good reasons from a scientific standpoint, and that's, well, it's dry bones, so it's not really the meat of the topic here, it's the bones of the talk, I suppose, that we're going to be looking at a couple of these. We're going to be focusing quickly on carbon-14 and the question of radioactive dating, looking at the preservation of original animal tissues that are still found within certain fossils, things that have supposedly been around for a very, very long time and yet are still gooey. And that's unexpected, to say the least. And then I'm going to get into a couple of geeky things that I like here, something called bioturbation, and don't worry, I'll define that. And I do speak human, so hopefully everybody will be with me here. I'm going to talk about fossils and footprints as well. So first up, carbon dating. Carbon dating is a technique that was developed in the 1950s on the understanding that carbon-14 is a radioactive material that decays at a predictable rate. If I have enough of the marbles in there and I drop a marble every once in a while, I kind of know how long the marbles have been dropping out of the bag, type of thing. Here's how it works. Carbon-14 is actually produced in the atmosphere all the time. Right now, carbon-14 is being made because solar radiation coming in from the sun kind of does a whole billiard ball reaction with some of the gases in the upper and middle atmosphere. And what ends up happening is a nitrogen gas, which makes up almost 80% of our atmosphere, has a proton knocked out of it. Now, if you remember back to chemistry, just briefly, you have your protons, you have your neutrons. Protons give us the atomic number on the periodic table. So hydrogen is a 1 because it has 1 proton. Helium is a 2 because it has 2 protons. And they're different atoms, and they behave differently because they have different amount of electrons. But those electrons are always the same number as the number of protons. So if we keep track of the protons, we kind of know what sort of element we're looking at, and different elements will bond in different ways because they have certain numbers of available electrons. So a nitrogen starts off as having 7 protons. But in this billiard ball reaction, one of those gets kicked out, which means you now have 6. And when you've got 6 protons, your identity is now carbon. That's what you are. And carbon and nitrogen are different atoms altogether. We use both of them in our body, but we use carbon as the scaffold, and nitrogen is one of the add-ons. Oxygen's an add-on. Hydrogen's an add-on. Carbon is the centerpiece for us and for all organic life. Well, that carbon quickly bonds with oxygen to make carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And then, well, plants suck that up. They use carbon dioxide, and then they break that apart, and they use the carbon in order to build, technical term here, planty bits. Right? They make leaves, they make stems, they make fruit, they make sap, they make roots, they make bark, they make all this sort of stuff. And that means that all the plants have traces of carbon-14 in it. And whether you're a vegetarian, or more like me, a secondary vegetarian, I eat the things that eat the plants. Praise God, right after the flood, God says, you can eat, there's rules, but you can eat. Like, great. And then in the New Testament, Peter gets a vision, you can eat anything. And the Gentiles all go, yes. Because I'm eating shrimp. I don't care if it's unclean. Until later on, and you go, maybe there was a good reason for that. So the plants get radioactive carbon in them, and then things eat the plants. And so Steve has been a wonderful host to me today, but he fed me radioactive food at breakfast. My cereal was laced with radioactive material. So was his. So, you know, he was being equitable about the whole thing. My mother fed me radioactive food, right? All of us can't escape that. All of us have trace amounts of carbon-14 in our body. Now, the good news is this is like 1 out of every trillion carbon atoms. So this gets into our bodies. It's not going to do any damage to us. It has a very mild radioactive decay that doesn't do much damage, and there's very little of it. Our body repairs this stuff all the time. But it's in there. And here's where things get weird. And I'm a weird guy, so you're going to have to bear with me here. Your body is a bathtub. I actually did a video of this in a bathtub with a pair of shorts and t-shirt, and I have students come up to me later on on campus, I saw you. You were in the tub. I was like, what was I talking about? They said, carbon. I said, it works. I don't care. I am shameless. I will do anything within Christian reason to make this stick in your head. But your body is a bathtub with carbon-14 as the water. From the moment that you were conceived, you had carbon-14 in that little zygote of an egg. Before you were conceived, that egg had carbon-14 because your mom had eaten cereal laced with carbon-14. The apple had carbon-14. Everything that we have has carbon-14 in it. And so the only thing that happened between then and now is you got bigger, but the ratio of carbon-14 in your body stays the same. There's more regular, there's more carbon-14. The level of that bathtub has always been the same, because the production of carbon-14 in the atmosphere turns out to be almost exactly the same rate of its rate of decay, which is weird. It doesn't have to be that way. This isn't one of those like design of the universe, this proves God. This is just weird. This is just a cool little quirk of physics, because the processes of creation and the processes of decay are completely unrelated to one another. So we just happen to be in this lucky little spot where God's given us an ability to find a timekeeper. So as long as you're alive, you get water in your tub from carbon-14, and as long as you're alive, you also have water leaving the tub. And so the spigot's on, the drain's open, but the level is the same. But then, sooner or later, you stop eating because you're no longer alive. And as soon as you die, you still have this level of water. You still have this level of carbon-14. But then over time, the drain isn't plugged because the process of decay is independent of the input. And so you start losing carbon-14. And you lose a little more. And you lose a little more. And it's on this basis then that people will then take a look at something that was organic, something that was alive, whether it was bones or teeth or shells or charcoal or wood or papyrus, and look at the amount of carbon-14 in it and say, well, based on how fast this decays, we can give you an age for that material. And it works pretty darn well. Now, so we have a question. If the dinosaur bones that I love so much are many millions of years old, they actually shouldn't have any carbon-14 in them because carbon decays very quickly. The bathtub is open with a big spigot on the bottom. The water drains out fast. It's not a drip. Every almost 6,000 years, you lose half of the carbon-14 that you had. And so within about 10 times of doing that, there's nothing left. We can't distinguish it with our equipment. But if the Earth is young, then carbon-14 might be found in the fossils because the organisms aren't actually that old. Right? So all original carbon-14 should have been decayed. And AMS, that stands for Accelerated Mass Spectrometer. That's the equipment that is used in order to detect this stuff. It gives us a theoretical limit of 100,000 years. The practical limit for most people, they think, is probably 40, 50, 60,000 years. But nonetheless, the equipment can detect all the way down to about this. After that, no more. But if the Earth is young, we might have some other things. And the original carbon-14, if there's any in there, we think that's because it hasn't had time to completely decay. So it turns out that carbon-14 is actually found in a wide variety of places in the fossil record. It is in all of our fossil fuels. We find traces of carbon-14 in petroleum, natural gas, and oil. We find it in coal. We find it even, and this was most surprising, in diamonds, which are supposed to be on the order of 1 to 2 billion years old, depending on where the diamonds are found. They're only found in very unusual geological settings that date back early in Earth's history. 2 billion years is pretty typical for an estimated date. And what I love about this is it was actually young Earth creationists that thought to look for them here. This had already been seen, or at least things like the natural gas and the oil and the coal. Some of these things were identified by scientists, conventional scientists, back in the 1970s and 80s. They could never get a sample that was completely dead with respect to carbon-14. Young Earth creationists went, well, if the Earth is young and diamonds were formed during creation week by certain processes of God's creation, they could still have carbon-14 in them. And so they sent some carbon samples through an intermediary to another lab and said, could you guys date this? And they went, we never tried diamonds before. Like, but is there anything to stop it? They're like, no, we can give it a shot. And it turned out that they came back with a date of about, on average, 52,000 years old for diamonds that are supposed to be 2 billion years old. So that's a little conundrum, right? Because my little kid can be 24 months or they can be 2 years. But that's the equivalent age. That's the same thing. You can't be both 2 years old. Well, you can't be, let's see, I'm 11 and 47 at the same time. But that's a quirk of being born on a weekday. I can't really be 11 and really be 47 at the same time. one of these ages is wrong, or both of them are. So what do we have here? Well, the likely reason here, I think, but I could be wrong, there's some other options within creationism on this as well. We could have that atmospheric carbon-14 production was actually somewhat lower in the past. We do have some independent evidence that the Earth's magnetic field was stronger in the past than it is today, and a stronger magnetic field would reduce the amount of carbon-14 formed because the solar radiation would be bounced off more effectively. We wouldn't get as much made coming through. And if that's the case, then we still have carbon-14 in these fossils, and they're giving us what looks like an old age because we're assuming we know where the bathtub level started. But that's one of those math equations, right? You know, if a train starts in Chicago and it heads towards Philadelphia running at 55 miles an hour, please stop talking, Dr. Ross. I hated those. Yes, right? But you had to do the backwards one, right? A train arrived in Philadelphia. When did it start in Chicago? But you're assuming it started in Chicago. What if it only came from Pittsburgh? That's a different answer. And so we don't know exactly what that level of the bathtub was. We think that it was the same all the way through, but it might not be, and that would change not the math. The math is still perfect. It's just now perfectly wrong. So, I think, therefore, I think then that this gives us some interesting and powerful evidence that the carbon-14 that's found in these different types of fossils, shells, coal, etc., diamonds, point to thousands of years and not millions of years old. And if the fossils are only thousands of years old, then the rocks that contain them can't be millions of years old. They have to be thousands of years old, because you can't put something young inside something old. You have to put something old inside something young. There's some other things going on here as well. What about preservation? Why is this important? Well, if the Earth is ancient, the preservation of original and unfossilized or unaltered, mostly unaltered material, if the Earth is ancient, we expect that these materials, the goo inside your bones, the developing blood cells, things like that, would not be able to survive, because even if they're hermetically sealed, there's just thermodynamic processes that are going to break down this material over the course of 60+ million years. But if the flood is responsible for these, then these materials are young, and we can still be within the time horizon before their ultimate degradation. It's still surprising that they exist. I was shocked when people started saying that there was original material. What sort of stuff? Well, the first paper that came out about this was in 2005. So we're coming up on almost 20 years of knowing about this now. From Mary Schweitzer. She is a paleontologist who works at North Carolina State University. I think she's coming up on retirement now. And Jack Horner. Jack Horner was the model for Alan Grant in the Jurassic Park movies. That was the person who Michael Crichton had in mind as he wrote that character. Jack Horner is an amazingly accomplished paleontologist, and he's a digger. He's a field guy. This is what they found inside a femur bone of a T-Rex that they were bringing up out of Montana. It was large enough that they actually had to break the bone to try to move it out. And when they did, Schweitzer said in an interview, it smelled like rotting meat. Fossils aren't supposed to smell that way, folks. I can say as an expert on that one. You're not supposed to smell like bad roadkill. They patched it, they brought it to the lab. She was working on an experiment with a graduate student where they were trying to dissolve some of the minerals of the bone, and he goofed. He made a mistake. He left the stuff sitting overnight rather than the 2 hours or so that he was supposed to do, and all the minerals were dissolved away. And he came back and he said, "Oh, sorry, I messed this one up. I'm going to need to do this again. But there's this stuff in here. I want you to take a look at it. It looks really weird and kind of interesting." And she looked at it, and her response was, "Do it again. And if we see it again, we're calling Jack." And this is what they found. These tubes are blood vessels. And these little balls inside here are high in iron and are very likely red blood cells. Dinosaur and actually all animal blood cells, all vertebrate blood cells, are actually spherical, except in mammals. We've got these weird little flat red blood cells because our red blood cells have no nucleus and they get all squashy. Everybody else has got fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, they all have nucleated red blood cells, and their red blood cells are little balls, little red balls inside the blood vessels. And these blood vessels, she showed a video of this to a Society of Paleontology meeting, and she was taking tweezers and moving them, and it would snap back into place. They didn't tear apart, they didn't crumble, they weren't brittle, they were elastic. And the whole audience just gasps. It's amazing. All this goo should not be there. And Schweitzer, being an astonishingly good scientist, didn't stop. She kept on going. She ended up finding more of this stuff in a hadrosaur, one of the duck-billed dinosaurs, the karate trachodons, right? That name Trachodon isn't with us anymore, by the way. That's an Atosaurus. I'm sorry to say Trachodon's no longer with us. I remember Trachodon fondly. But this one is Brachylophosaurus canadensis. So she found that original one in a T-Rex. She went to another layer lower down. The T-Rex was supposed to be 68 million years. This is an 80 million year old layer with a duck-billed dinosaur. Found the same stuff and more. So here again, we've got one of these branching blood vessels. This is the blood vessel of a modern ostrich. So we wanted to compare it. Notice that there's this little thing right here. This is a scanning electron microscope picture. This is a cell called an osteocyte. It's the bone-forming cells in the body. They're always found right nearby the blood vessels because they need a lot of stuff to build the bone around there and constantly needing nutrients to make bone. Duck-billed dinosaur has got a cell right at the juncture point here. The cell has been preserved. This is unreal. Not only that, but they figured out a way to test these materials to see if they still had the original undegraded proteins, and they do. This was her paper that came out later on. Molecular analysis of dinosaur osteocytes support the presence of endogenous molecules. That means original molecules. These little fluorescent dots here are fluorescent tags, and doctors use these all the time to follow medications in somebody's body. And what this does is, it's a lot like, I always had trouble telling this to my students in college because they weren't married, and it's like, this is like a pregnancy test, and they're like, what are you saying, Dr. Ross? And well, the pregnancy test, right? You get the thing and it says 99.99% accurate. And you're like, I got you at the Dollar Tree. I don't know about this, right? But yes, even the Dollar Tree ones are 99.99% accurate. And why is that? Well, when a woman becomes pregnant, I'm using the word woman, her, not just birthing person, but you know, when a woman becomes pregnant, you got to throw that dig in, her body produces hormones. And those hormones, on the pregnancy test, there's an antibody that will bind to those hormones, and will only bind to those hormones, not to any other substance in the universe. It's like a hand fitting into a glove, and it's only this. And that's why when that little line shows up, even on the ones from Dollar Tree, you can go to CVS and get the more expensive one. That's fine. You can go to the doctor. The answer is the answer. So what they did is they created these antibodies for 3 different proteins that are only found in vertebrate animals. Because some of the criticism of Schweitzer's work early on was maybe these are bacteria inside that are coating where the blood vessels used to be. And so we've got this kind of bacterial film that has been made, and it's mimicking. And the scientists showed examples of how that can happen. And so I remember sitting next to my PhD advisor. We met back up, and he was like, boy, I don't know. I really did like that dinosaur original material, but these guys make a good point. And they did. Schweitzer comes back and is like, are you kidding? Bacteria can't make these because this is collagen, and this is this, and this is that. These are 3 things that only vertebrate animals make, and there's the proof right there. Because we've tagged them with fluorescent dye, we hit them with the light. Sure enough, they've tagged in there. This is not bacteria. All right, I'm back in with the dinosaur stuff again, and the whole time I'm just like, yeah, this is pretty cool. Because a lot of people didn't like Schweitzer's work. A lot of paleontologists were very, very antagonistic towards Schweitzer, and were absolutely certain that she just screwed up. Because the clear implications seem to be that these molecules can't survive 80 million years. I don't care if you put them in a vacuum. I don't care if you put them in a minus 80-degree freezer. Schweitzer has documented the degradation of these materials in her lab since they've been excavated. So these things can't last forever. So, two other quick things as we move through. Fossil footprints in the fossil record. So animals move around and they leave little tracks. And we go to the beach and we leave our footprints, and they don't usually stick around because the wind and the waves just kind of obliterate all of that. In order to make tracks, you need a pretty special environment. You need something that is firm enough for the animal to make the tracks in. And then you also need some way of preserving those tracks very quickly before they get obliterated. And you also can't obliterate them in the process of trying to preserve them. So you've got some unique circumstances here. So we might have a little trilobite over here that's been leaving some tracks. Shells and teeth and bones and stuff like that, those are durable materials. We call those body fossils because they're the hard parts of the animal. The trace fossils are much more difficult to get to. Their tracks and the footprints are made in mud. They're made in sand. They're very delicate. So what does this mean for a young Earth or for a rapid formation of the fossil record or a global flood? Well, if the Earth is ancient and footprints and tracks, we would expect those to be pretty randomly distributed. Right? It's only under very unique circumstances that we find these, and we'd find them interspersed amongst the bones of the types of animals or the shells of the types of animals that would place them. So we would expect there to be occasional trilobite trackways in and amongst all the other trilobite fossils. So there we've got our different layers of sedimentary rocks. We've got our body fossils that are very abundant, and we have our tracks that are fairly rare in comparison. And tracks are rare in comparison. But there's something really interesting about the fossil record of a number of different groups, including dinosaurs and trilobites and several others, and that is we actually find footprints of the critters before we find their body fossils. So very high likelihood of finding these, and yet these rare things are the ones that are showing up first. That's odd. The very first fossils of any trilobites that we have are trackways. And in order to make a trackway, you need feet. You need hard little feet, like a horseshoe crab type of thing. You can't make this with little squishy feet. They look different that way. Dinosaurs certainly have bones in their feet, and the very first fossils that we have of dinosaurs are actually of their feet. And their prints, not the actual foot. And even that, when we take a look at dinosaurs, the first footprints of large meat-eating dinosaurs come before we have any fossil record of large meat-eating dinosaurs. What is going on? So here's a couple of examples of the gaps in the record between the feet and the footprints. 10 million years difference between the trilobites, 30 million years between the first amphibians and the footprints of the amphibians way before. Turtle footprints. I can tell you this about turtles. When we have them in the fossil record, you know it. There's little bits of shell everywhere. Turtles, their bodies are quasi-indestructible, right? You just got hard shell everywhere. So as soon as you have turtles in the fossil record, you just know it. But their footprints are found 25 million years before the turtles? That doesn't make any sense. And like I said, dinosaur foot tracks 5 million years before the dinosaurs, and large theropods 30 million years before the actual fossils of them, the footprints, show up. But let's think about this. If the Earth is young and the sediments are actually forming very, very rapidly, then the trackways can be found below the bones and the hard parts of the trace makers, because what we've got are animals that are trying to escape. And they're running away, leaving tracks only to be caught later on by the sediments that are going to catch the body fossils of them. So this idea of rapid sediment accumulation means that the tracks and the bodies actually have more even odds for fossilization. And the gaps actually have an answer. Rather than there being 10 million years between the trilobite footprints and the trilobites got to be there. They're the only things that make these particular kinds of tracks. We know those tracks really, really well. But if there's a short period of time in which they're trying to flee and escape from the sediment waves that are coming through, and on land the rising floodwaters, they're leaving footprints. The waters bury the footprints, and it might only be days or hours later that the dinosaurs themselves get trapped up in the water and pulled back into a lower basin on top of the places where their footprints are, or someplace a little bit further away. But the distance in time can be compressed to hours and days rather than millions and millions of years. last item here, bioturbation. So let's break down this word. Bio is life, and turbid means stirred up. So if you stir up, your drink with, you put in some nutrient powder. I don't like these things, but you throw in some nutrient powder, all of a sudden it's all cloudy. It's a turbid mixture now. So when organisms are the ones that stir up things, not just water, but they're stirring up the sediment itself. So here's how it works. When a big storm like a hurricane comes through on the East Coast, it will move around all the sediment on the bottom of the ocean. And because the waves are moving at certain types of speeds, they'll end up creating these really nice layered sediments. You'll get these fine bands of different colors of sediment and different units of sand versus mud and clay and more sand and whatnot. But as soon as all of that stops, all the animals that had just been jostled and tossed around a bit get their senses, and they start doing what they normally do, is they start looking for food. And so you have clams that will start burrowing vertically up and down. You're going to have shrimp that start burrowing all over the place. They go kind of in 3 dimensions with a little nest, and then they go out this way, they go out this way, they go out this way. You have worms that are going all over the place. And so these different types of animals are really working hard to find food, and as they do, they take those nice layers, they obliterate them. And there's been some really neat studies that were done during the 1980s and into the 1990s following after hurricanes, where basically as soon as the hurricane passed, a research boat would jump on out there and take a grid and look at what was going on in the marine community after such a big disturbance. Then in the 2000s, a group of scientists decided to do this inside the laboratory. They took a 1 meter by 1 meter plot, and they created an estuary environment with a whole bunch of sediment, made nice layers in it, and they tossed in 10 animals. They put in a shrimp, they put in a couple of worms, 2 clams, basically what's going to be later on, except for the worms, a really nice dinner, right? And they let them go. And they found that it turned out that they worked really quickly. Here's a picture of some of the different types of traces that we see in the fossil record of when these animals are moving around. This is a schematic showing a bunch of the different sorts of images. You've got these U-shaped ones. These are one of my favorites because their name is Diplocriterion yo-yo. Diplocriterion because it's 2 entrances or exits here, and yo-yo because you can sometimes see these things go down and then go back up again. So the animal is digging back up and down like this. So it gets this funny name. This would be something like what the shrimp burrows would look like. You get this mottled stuff up at the top if it was really extensive, little burrows. This is the trilobite walkways. These are called Cruisiana, another cool name. They're just kind of cruising around, leaving trackways. And here are examples of what bioturbation looks like in the fossil record. This would be very heavy bioturbation, where you kind of can't see any layers at all. It's all just a mottled mess. And you can look at some of the limestones around here, and you see this kind of weird little mottled surface. The animals had a good chance to do a lot of bioturbation. This would be much more normal for the fossil record, where you see a little bit here and there, but overall a good bit of the layers are visible. And this would be an example of basically no bioturbation whatsoever. You've just got really nice layerings. So if the Earth is ancient, we're going to compare and contrast again. There should be very few fine layered sediments because, hurricanes don't come around all that often, and animals are busy, and from what we know, they move pretty quick. So if the organisms tunnel through everything, and in 0 time, geologically, everything's obliterated. It only takes days, and in one of the situations where they put animals in, they put in more than 10. The 10 were able to obliterate everything in the span of a few days. And if you're talking about millions of years, that's nothing. That's a second. They put in a more reasonable amount that would be expected in some place like the Chesapeake Bay, and they found that those organisms could obliterate all the sediment layers within 61 minutes. So if bioturbation happens that fast, we wouldn't expect really hardly anything to have nice layers unless it's in environments that are very hostile to organisms. You have no oxygen down at the bottom of the ocean, or you have toxic levels of different chemicals. But if the Earth is young and the sediments are being made very, 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 very rapidly, then you expect there to be very little bioturbation, and you'd only have bioturbation when there's a little pause in the action. The animals get their bearings and they can try and do what they normally do before the next wave of sediment starts to compress and bury them again. So my friends, Art Chadwick and Leonard Brand, borrowing their illustration here, this is from their textbook, Faith, Reason, and Earth History. They decided to do a study where they started in the Grand Canyon and moved their way up through Utah. They studied over 1 vertical mile of sediments. That's a lot of hundreds of miles of going to study a full vertical mile of sediment. And they found that there was bioturbation everywhere, but with a caveat. So here's our geological column, our Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, our Jurassic. Bailey's, I gotta get this one's a little fuzzy. But the black here represents the areas that they were studying, the measured layers that they went through, and the little squiggles here represent bioturbation. And sure enough, you can see there's a lot of bioturbation here. But if you zoomed in on a typical unit, actually the Triassic Moenkopi formation, so Triassic over here, the Moenkopi is going to be like this unit right here. This was one of the most heavily bioturbated units that they studied. And here's the measurement in terms of how many meters. So this is a 60-meter thick unit, so 200 feet thick. And bioturbation is happening, but it's very isolated. So while over here we say, oh, look, we've got bioturbation, you zoom in, it's like, yeah, we have a little here and there, a few places, but overall not much. And this was one of the most heavily bioturbated units. They also noted that bioturbation tends to happen towards the top of these units, which is exactly when there tends to be pauses or changes in the geological action. Whatever organisms have a chance to do something, they do something, and other ones are too far down. They just don't have time before they're compressed and killed. I mean, we think of animals dying and then being fossilized. These animals, in some cases, are dying by fossilization. Much more typical was the Cretaceous Mancos shale, and this one has a little bit of bioturbation. This is the unit over here showing heavy bioturbation, very light, and basically almost nothing. And you go, wow, that's not a lot. That's not a lot going on here. It's not what I would expect if the Earth was very, very ancient. So, overall, I think from the science end of things, we can say that carbon-14 gives us some interesting indicators of a recent group of fossils, and therefore a recent group of rocks. We also see that the preservation of these original biological materials gives us a very close horizon, thousands of years, not tens of millions, for their existence. And the evidence from trackways and from bioturbation indicates that there's not much time that's happening in between these different events. And I think that a global flood in the recent past that produces the vast majority of our fossil record makes sense, both with the biblical text, certainly, but also with a variety of our different scientific evidences. That doesn't mean that this proves a young Earth. It doesn't mean that it proves the flood. Proof is a hard thing in science. Right? You have to have some very clear A, B, and I've given you some of those. But we also have a number of challenges. Carbon-14, I think, is a good guy for young Earth creation. I'm liking carbon-14. Uranium dating, that's a tougher nut to crack. That's harder. We've got some interesting things going on with that, but that is used to date, that's used to give you the millions of years ages. And we've got some interesting things for young Earth creationism on that, but we haven't solved that one completely. And that, again, brings me back, I guess, to thinking about kids learning and learning in critical thinking. And that we've got to be able to teach kids a certain level of robustness to know that sometimes you won't have all the answers that you want. And you don't want to spiral down into a skeptical zone where you feel you have to have an answer for absolutely everything because you might not get them. And it's okay to hold on to something firmly and yet also tentatively, or to know that I have to put something on a shelf for a little while because I don't know the answer to that, but I have enough good reason over here to think this that I'm all right with leaving something on the shelf and praying that God will raise up the right people to answer this one, because maybe I don't have the skills for that. I'm not a biochemist. I can't answer questions about whether Mike Behe's irreducible complexity argument is right or wrong. I think he's right, but other people have said he's wrong. I tend to trust him. I like his argument, but I can't do that. But I've got to rely on others, and there are thankfully others out there that can say, yeah, this works, and it works even better over here and here and here. And you go, all right, I feel a little bit better. There's a lot of these things that as a student, I didn't have any good answers for, and some of them are showing up now. It might take 20 years. It might take 30 years. But we are the people who wait for God in eager expectation for his return. It could happen at any moment. And yet what are we to do in the meantime? We are to abide. We're to keep on working in hope and expectation, but to be busy about our Father's work. So in some senses, don't sweat the small stuff. Don't sweat too much of the big stuff either, but pay attention, and hopefully God will continue to raise up more. And you never know what those kids in those classes right now are going to end up finding later on when they get a chance to look into God's creation, to look into his handiwork and say, I wonder what. So thank you very much. I'd be happy to take some questions.
Take a couple questions.
Of course I would. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
We have time for a couple questions, so any questions? Phyllis?
Yes. Okay. Phyllis, yeah.
Go ahead.
Yes.
So going back to the carbon 14 and the bathtub, you mentioned how a stronger magnetic field around the Earth would result in less carbon 14 production in the atmosphere. What effect would more or less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere have on carbon 14 production?
Good question. It will have very little ultimate effect on the rest of the biosphere. So the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is independent of the carbon-14. The carbon-14 that gets proposed is such a small trace onto that. It's about 1 out of every trillion carbon atoms is a carbon-14. And so if the Earth's magnetic field is stronger, then you end up with 1 out of every 4 trillion or something like that. And that's still not going to make any difference to anything biologically because they're relying on all those other trillions for that. So all it's going to do is then make a change in what the initial level of that bathtub happens to be. And you might end up with a bathtub that is really, really small and has a big vent, and you actually have trouble maintaining how much carbon-14 is in your body because you're losing it faster than you're pulling it in. If that ratio of production is far lower than what it is today. But as far as the biological reliance on carbon dioxide, it's going to be perfectly fine. Good question, thanks. Yes, sir.
Is the reason that Mary Schweitzer was the first to find soft tissue in the dinosaur bones and bones because of that accident that took place, or did other people just not bother looking for it, not thinking it couldn't be there?
Yeah, in my training in paleontology, when we were being taught about how fossilization happens, we were taught that a fossil is more or less something that has been fully replaced by minerals. Whatever bone or shell you had was pretty much completely replaced. If you're looking at Ice Age stuff, you still have original bone material, and people were looking for DNA in mammoths, before Schweitzer was seeing any of this stuff in T-Rex. But the stuff that you kind of look at and you say, well, that's 30, 40, 50 million years old. There's no way. So part of that was simply none of us ever thought it was possible. And even I, as a young Earth creationist, never thought it was possible because I was told this is how fossilization happens. And it turned out, by lucky accident, that Schweitzer found something entirely different. And that's why the reaction in the paleo community was so virulent at the beginning of like, this can't be right. And yet we're also looking at her tweezing this thing and going, whoa, this is Schweitzer's initial paper in 2005 is going to be one of those papers that is still going to be cited 150 years from now. It's one of those papers that is so important, radically giving us something new to think about in paleontology, in science generally. This is why it was published in Science. It's a big deal. And her further work after that is going to put her certainly in the Hall of Fame amongst paleontologists into the future. She deserves to be there.